Remember when your biggest worry was getting home before the streetlights came on? If you grew up in the 1970s, that sentence probably just unlocked a flood of memories. But here's the thing, those experiences are still there, quietly shaping how you think, how you connect with others, and how you see the world today. The 1970s was a weird time to be a kid. It was sandwiched between the chaos of the 60s and the excess of the 80s, and in a lot of ways, it was its own universe. There was no internet, no cell phones, no helicopter parents hovering over every move. Kids were just out there, and that created a very specific type of person. Let's talk about independence first, because this is huge. If you grew up in the 70s, you were probably given a level of freedom that would make modern parents have a panic attack. You'd leave the house in the morning, and your parents wouldn't see you again until dinner. You'd ride your bike across town, play in construction sites, build forts in the woods, and generally do things that would now require 3 adult supervisors. This wasn't neglect. Parents trusted that kids would figure things out, and for the most part they did. You learned to live through conflicts with other kids without adult intervention. You learned to assess risks on your own. You fell out of trees and got back up. You got lost and found your way home. Every single one of these experiences was teaching your brain something important. You are capable of handling things yourself. Fast forward to today, and this shows up in some pretty distinct ways. People who grew up in the 70s tend to be incredibly self-reliant. They're the ones who will try to fix something themselves before calling a professional. They're comfortable making decisions without needing constant validation. They don't panic easily because they've been in situations where they had to figure things out on their own, and they survived. But there is a flip side to this. Sometimes this independence can look like stubbornness or an unwillingness to ask for help. When you've been conditioned from age 6 that you should be able to handle things yourself, admitting you need assistance can feel like failure. This is something a lot of 70s kids still wrestle with as adults. Now let's talk about boredom, because boredom was a huge part of growing up in the 70s. There were only a few TV channels, and they didn't even broadcast all day. There were no video games in most homes until the very end of the decade. No tablets, no phones, no endless scroll of content. You had to actually entertain yourself. And this is where something magical happened. Boredom forced creativity. You'd take cardboard boxes and turn them into spaceships. You'd make up bewildering games with nothing but sticks and your imagination. You'd spend hours just talking to your friends, creating entire worlds out of thin air. Your brain learned to generate its own entertainment, to find interest in ordinary things, to be resourceful. Today, this translates into a different relationship with downtime. People who grew up in the 70s often have hobbies, and we're talking real hobbies, those that demand time and effort. They're more comfortable with silence and stillness. They don't need constant stimulation to feel okay. But they can also sometimes struggle with the pace of modern technology and the expectation to be constantly available and engaged. The world moved from their childhood rhythm to something much faster, and that adjustment doesn't work for everyone. Here's another big thing: delayed gratification. In the 1970s, if you wanted something, you usually had to wait for it. Want to see a movie? You'll have to wait until Saturday, go to the theater, and if you missed it, you might not see it for years. Want to know something? You had to go to the library and look it up in a book, maybe even wait a couple weeks for someone to return the copy. Want to talk to your friend? You had to call their house, hope they were home, and more often than not, talk to their parents first. Everything took time, and your brain adapted to this reality. You learned patience. You learned that wanting something and getting it weren't the same thing. You learned to work toward goals without immediate rewards. This is probably one of the biggest psychological differences between 70s kids and people who grew up later. The ability to delay gratification is linked to all kinds of positive outcomes: better financial decisions, healthier relationships, career success, you name it. People from the 70s had this skill drilled into them just by living in that era. But it also means they can sometimes struggle with the instant nature of modern life, or feel frustrated with younger generations who expect immediate results. Now let's shift gears and talk about social connection for a bit, as this was fundamentally different back then. Your social world was limited to the people who were physically around you. Your neighborhood friends, your classmates, maybe some cousins. That was basically it. You couldn't text someone across the country or maintain friendships with people you'd never met in person. Your relationships were local, face-to-face, and rooted in physical proximity. This created a different kind of social skill. You had to learn to read body language, tone of voice, and facial expressions. You had to deal with conflicts in real time without being able to hide behind a screen. You learned the art of conversation, of reading a room, of picking up on subtle social cues. These were basic survival skills, and this is why people who grew up in the 70s often have strong interpersonal skills. There's also something to be said about the lack of documentation. In the 70s, cameras were expensive, film was limited, and most moments just happened, and then were gone. There are probably entire years of your childhood where only a handful of photos exist. You weren't performing for a camera. You were just living. And this created a different relationship with self-image and identity. Without constant documentation and feedback, you developed a sense of self that was more internal. And resilience? 70s kids developed this in spades. The world was just rougher around the edges back then. Playgrounds had metal slides that got scorching hot in summer, and jungle gyms over concrete. Bikes didn't come with helmets. Seatbelts weren't really enforced. You got hurt, you brushed it off, and you kept going. But it wasn't just physical toughness. There was also less emotional cushioning. If you got made fun of at school, adults didn't intervene unless it was really serious. If you failed at something, you didn't get a participation trophy. If you were scared, you were often told to toughen up. This wasn't always healthy, but it did teach people to develop their own coping mechanisms. So as adults, this generation tends to be pretty tough. They don't fall apart easily. They can handle discomfort. They've been through enough scraped knees and hurt feelings to know that most things are survivable. But again, there's a shadow side. Sometimes this toughness can make it hard to be vulnerable or to recognize when something actually does require help or intervention. The just deal with it mentality that served them as kids doesn't always serve them as adults. Authority was also different. Teachers, parents, coaches, they had authority, and you didn't question it much. If you got in trouble at school, you got in trouble at home too. There wasn't this sense that adults needed to justify every rule or that kids deserved a say in every decision. You mostly did what you were told, and that was that. Now here's the real catch. This created a relationship with authority that still shows up today. On one hand, 70s kids can be respectful of institutions and hierarchies. They understand the chain of command. They don't assume their opinion is always the most important one in the room. But on the other hand, many of them also developed a healthy skepticism of authority, especially as they saw Watergate unfold and saw that the people in charge weren't always trustworthy. This generation learned to respect authority, but not to blindly trust it. And let's not forget about the lack of safety nets. In the 70s, there wasn't the same social awareness around mental health, learning disabilities, or different types of intelligence. If you struggled in school, you were just not good at school. If you were anxious or depressed, you were told to snap out of it. If you learned differently, you were expected to keep up anyway. This meant a lot of 70s kids just had to figure out their own workarounds. They developed grit and determination, but also internalized the message that struggling meant something was wrong with them. Basically, they were taught that needing help was a weakness. As you might imagine, the media landscape also shaped psychology in interesting ways. As I've already explained, You only had about 3 TV channels, and everyone watched the same shows. You listened to the radio, and everybody heard the same songs. There was a shared cultural experience that just doesn't exist anymore. You could reference a TV show and know that almost everyone your age would get it. This created a sense of collective identity and shared reality. But it also meant less diversity in perspectives. You saw the world through a pretty narrow lens, mostly white, mostly middle class, mostly traditional. For people who fit that mold, it felt normal. For people who didn't, it felt isolating. That's why many 70s kids are still learning to expand their perspectives and understand experiences different from their own. And finally, the expectations. Oh, the expectations. If you grew up in the 70s, you knew that the path forward seemed pretty clear for most kids. You'd graduate high school, maybe go to college, get a job, get married, buy a house, and have kids. The script was written, and most people followed it without questioning too much whether it was what they actually wanted. This created a generation that's often very achievement-oriented and goal-focused, sure, but it also created a lot of people who reached midlife and suddenly wondered if they'd been living someone else's dream. The lack of options felt safe at the time, but it also meant less room for self-discovery and authenticity. So, what does all of this add up to? People who grew up in the 70s are independent, resourceful, patient, and resilient. They value face-to-face connection, have strong interpersonal skills, and can handle discomfort. They're tough, self-reliant, and don't need constant stimulation to feel okay. But they can also be stubborn about asking for help, uncomfortable with vulnerability, and sometimes out of step with how the modern world operates. They might struggle with the pace of technology, the nature of online relationships, or the idea that their way isn't the only way. The psychology of 70s kids is really the psychology of a generation that was raised to be independent in a world that was slower, less forgiving. They learned to rely on themselves because, well, they had to. They learned to be patient because there was no other option. They learned to be tough because the world didn't cushion its blows. And here's the beautiful part. Those skills are still valuable. In a world that's increasingly fast, fragmented, and overwhelming, the ability to be self-reliant, patient, and resilient might be more important than ever. The 70s might be long gone, but the people it shaped are still here, still carrying those experiences forward, still figuring out how to bridge the gap between the world they grew up in and the world they're living in now. If you're one of those people, do me a favor and take a second to appreciate what that decade gave you. Yeah, there were things that weren't great about it, but there were also things that made you who you are today. And if you're not from that generation, but you know someone who is, maybe this gives you a little insight into why they are the way they are. So guys, drop us a comment and share your thoughts about growing up in the 70s. And subscribe to our channel if you want to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.